Hey everyone, Tactics here, where in this video I'll be giving my initial thoughts and feedback for all 6 tank specs now that we've had some time to test them out on the 11.1 PTR. Now, I'm sure I'm going to get some of those comments and people are going to immediately ask, what tank spec do I think is the best in Season 2? And just to be very clear here, it is way too early to tell at this point. There's a lot of bugs, both positive and negative. Some things just don't work at all. Some things are just not working as intended. Plus, there's going to be at least a month of tuning and adjustments to come. But don't worry, once the dust starts to settle, I will give my thoughts in a future video, probably like the week before the patch actually goes live. Now let's get into this video. Where to start, I actually want to talk about how the tank roll 2-piece tier bonus is working out, as well as give a suggestion on how to improve it across the board. For those that don't know, in this next patch, Blizzard has given every role their own shared 2-piece bonus that is themed around the new raid, so all tanks end up with a similar effect here as their 2-piece bonus. Honestly, I'm not the biggest fan of this. It's not my preference. It's fine though, and I know a lot of people have claimed that it'll potentially make things easier to tune, which in theory I do agree with, but we are seeing that in practice here there is one tank spec in particular that is just getting a lot more out of this 2-piece bonus than the others. Currently looking at the tank 2-piece effect, it gives you a chance on being hit to get 4 seconds of your big damage reduction ability, so Survival Instincts, Icebound Fortitude, Guardian of Ancient Kings, Shield Wall, Metamorphosis, and Fortifying Brew, though obviously that last one's a little bit weaker than the rest, so they give you 6 seconds of it instead. Now, for 5 out of 6 of the tank specs, this functions the same. It's a random proc, defensive. Maybe you get value out of it. Chances are, more often than not, you're not going to get a ton of value out of it because it's such a short duration, and it's not something that you can actually rely on. It's a relatively low proc rate, so who knows if it's actually going to be active when you need it. For Vengeance, though, the tier set is procking meta, which actually interacts in a pretty fun way with the Felscarred hero tree, empowering some of your abilities and even giving you resets when it procs. Now, there's certainly an argument that in its current state, where it functions essentially like you pressing meta, is probably too powerful. Maybe it needs to be brought down a little bit. However, I would urge Blizzard here to maybe take some inspiration from the interactions this tier set specifically provides to Vengeance, and then apply that to the 5 other tank specs, giving them something that is both more fun to play with and also something that is generally more useful no matter when it procs. So going through the list of tanks here, Guardians, you could have this proc Incarnation. Paladins, you could have this proc Wings, of course. Warriors could proc Avatar. Blood DKs could proc Dancing Rune Weapon, and Brewmasters could proc Weapons of Order. And for Vengeance, you could make this act as if a Feldev meta was procced instead of a full, meaning it would only empower Spirit Bomb and Soul Cleave instead of giving you all the resets, which probably puts it back in line with some of these other buttons that I'm recommending here. Again, you can change these up, but I think generally these cooldowns would be much more fun and interactive than the current sets, which are just procking some random DR that you don't really get a lot of use out for the most part. So I would like to see those. You could also adjust the damage buff that's currently tied to the 2-piece if you think these are too powerful in combination with those, since they also have offensive upside. Whatever you want to do here, just my 2 cents. I think these would be way more fun than the current iteration, though, and you don't need to get rid of the fun that Vengeance Demon Hunter is having with their 2-piece at the same time. Speaking of Vengeance, let's talk about them first in terms of the tank stuff. Outside of their extremely strong 2-piece, which we just discussed, they also have some beneficial bugs, so I wouldn't expect the current state of Vengeance Demon Hunter to go live as is, assuming those things get fixed. Vengeance did receive some small gains in the patch notes with a buff to Demon Spike's uptime, as well as increased meta uptime just from their tier, so it just makes it a bit easier to juggle their defensives. I would like to see them potentially just get an entirely new 4-piece though, as currently it's just a chance for that random proc 2-piece to reset the hunt, which is a talent that is pretty expensive to get in your tree that you don't necessarily want. Plus, again, in Mythic Plus situations, it can actually be kind of dangerous to use. So something new here I think would be nice, because I've seen a lot of demon hunters here, myself included, just kind of not spec into hunt right now and pretend they don't have a 4-piece, which probably is not something Blizzard wants. Maybe if you were really stuck on the hunt, you could do something to buff its output defensively a bit more, but I'd like to see something new here personally. Next, let's talk about a few tank specs which have received no real changes, starting with Brewmaster, which again, I'm going to caveat by saying this is definitely the tank spec that I have the least experience with. It plays basically the same as it does now, meaning it'll probably be solid in raids and kind of mid and mythic plus. In terms of feedback, I would just really like to see Nu Zhao get some love before the patch launch. There is 3 whole talents smack dab in the middle of the Brewmaster tree that they just actively avoid so that they don't have to spec into their iconic cooldown because it's just so poorly tuned. So please send Brews some help here. Boost up our Ox. Blood Decays, another tank spec with no major changes, so the spec likely is going to perform similarly to Season 1 if there's no other changes before the PTR cycle ends, meaning very powerful in raids and weekly keys, but likely struggling to push into the highest level of keys themselves. Again, this is a situation where, a bit like Brewmaster, maybe they could try and implement a talent somewhere in the capstone area to assist with their Mythic Plus struggles, but that's probably a bit more involved, seeing as that talent currently doesn't exist, so maybe not something that I'd expect to see on the patch launch. In terms of their tier, specifically their 4-piece, I would like to see them do a bit more for it in single target specifically, as currently it's just -2 runic power to death strike and 2 seconds on the damage buff duration if you're only fighting a single target, which is only slightly better than the Vengeance Demon Hunter one that does literally nothing if you aren't specced into the hunt. That being said, in AoE, the cleaving of Deathstrike is actually pretty nice, and over the course of my dungeon runs, it seemed to be adding like somewhere in the ballpark of 30% more Deathstrike hits over the course of the entire dungeon, which is pretty significant, right? But single target definitely needs some love. Moving on, we have Prot Paladin, who is the final tank to receive no changes going into the patch, though they did recently receive quite a bit of work in 1105, putting them in the top spot in Mythic Plus. So we'll have to see if Blizzard lets them hold that spot for 2 seasons in a row, or if there are some impending changes to knock them down a bit. I don't really have a lot to talk about here, seeing as the spec was already in a pretty nice spot, and so far nothing has changed. Maybe something to note is that their 4-piece bonus does seem to be the best out of all the tank specs at the moment, giving them very, very high uptime on their damage bonus, combined with just a lot more Shield of the Righteous casts in general, good for AoE and single target. So that's just another tick in the win column for them, at least for now. Then we move on to the tanks, which received some adjustments so far in the PTR, starting with Guardian Druids, who had their general tree reworked, making it much nicer to navigate, which I am very, very happy to see. I no longer need to make rant videos talking about how bad the Druid general tree is every patch, so thank you, Blizzard. This also added in a pretty cool new talent called Symbiotic Relationship, which basically lets you put a beacon healing effect onto an ally, causing your self-healing to also heal them for 10% of that amount, which is pretty cool, in my opinion. I do just want to quickly flag that Lycara's Meditation, another new talent, is potentially problematic here, as it gives you the Lycara's Teaching stat bonuses of another form for 5 seconds after you swap out of it, which I'm sure is going to lead to some weird human shifting shenanigans as a Guardian Druid. And I think I've also heard whispers of it potentially even being used by things like Boomkins. So let's just stop all this weird stuff with this talent before it starts and just remove it. Put something else there. I do also still need to complain that you have to path through Soothe or Cyclone for some reason to go down to the middle area of the capstone tree, which feels weird. Maybe put that somewhere else. But I'll stop. The general tree is generally much, much, much improved. For the spec tree, they saw a rework to Reinvigoration, causing it to increase the potency of Frenzied Regen instead of CDR it, as well as Raise, now once again replacing Maul, but gaining a passive that doubles its damage if it only hits a single target, so it's no longer a single target DPS loss to spec into it like it was back when it was first introduced. On top of this, Layered Main was removed in exchange for a new talent that gives you a magic DR based on your current armor DR, capping at 10% of that value. This does sound pretty nice, but it's important to remember that armor DR is capped here, so this ends up being a 2 talent point investment for a maximum of 8.5% magic DR. Love the idea here, definitely along the right track, but the power feels a bit low at the moment, especially for that 2-point investment. Honestly, you could double the value of this talent, and maybe then it would be better capping instead of like a 17% magic DR at max armor, at armor cap, right, which takes quite a few Iron First stacks to actually get to. You could also maybe shuffle this around and make it a 1-point talent somewhere in the tree, but again, not really expecting a talent tree shuffle at this point to come before the 0.1 patch launch. In terms of the tier, It's got absolutely zero gameplay impact, which is a bit sad. I've said it before. One of my favorite parts of tier sets is the fact that they change up how a spec plays within an expansion, and we're just not getting that here in a lot of other cases, and specifically in the Guardian Druid case as well. Couple pieces of feedback on it specifically, though. One, it looks like it currently can't cast Raise as one of the random spells, so potentially that should be added to the list of eligible spells. And two, if you're spec'd into fluid form, your tier bonus can actually cause you to catch shift, which definitely is not ideal, so make sure that gets fixed. Finally, we've got Protection Warriors, who actually saw quite a few nerfs going into this patch, targeted specifically at the speed of the spec's gameplay due to their high resource generation. These nerfs saw rage generation from cooldowns reduced across the board, as well as your chance to proc shield slam resets also being lowered. As compensation, they increased the power of an individual ignore pain by 30%, as well as reduced the cooldown on shield wall by 30 seconds. Now, I do just want to state here, it feels very odd that Prot Warrior is getting singled out for this problem, as they aren't the only tank spec that has extremely fast gameplay due to a high resource generation and an off-the-global spender. Both Guardian Druid and Prot Paladin function the exact same way, and in fact, the Prot Paladin tier bonus this patch is doubling down on that gameplay, speeding it up even more when you get these procs. So it is just kind of odd for me that Prot Warrior was specifically nerfed in this department and the other two were untouched. Now, speaking on the Prot Warrior gameplay on PTR, it definitely feels slower compared to the 11.0 iteration, which obviously was Blizzard's stated goal, but it would be nice to see some additional compensation buffs for their damage, seeing as this has a significant negative impact on their avatar uptime, which of course is fueled by your rage spent. Not to mention that it leads to you casting rage dump spells like Revenge and like Execute much less. Let's talk about that a bit more though. So even the current iteration of Prot Warrior gets you into situations where you have like a dead global here and there, maybe Shield Slam and Thunderclap are both on cooldown. You don't have the rage to press Revenge. So you're just kind of waiting there, hoping for something to either come off cooldown or for your autos to proc a Shield Slam reset. This is kind of okay. It doesn't feel too bad because it's usually not a very large amount of downtime, and it's not super frequent, right? It happens, you know, a couple times over the course of several minute boss fight maybe, but not super frequent, and when it does happen, it's kind of small. The changes they've done here have made this issue significantly worse, where you can go several seconds quite often without anything to press, because not only are you getting less Shield Slam procs now, as that percentage was reduced from 30% to 20%, you also need to think a lot more about the rage that you're spending, which that isn't necessarily a bad thing for the record. But previously, there are lots of situations where you're happy to fill a dead global with Revenge and just dump some rage, but maybe now you can't do that because you're generating a lot less rage, and so you see this rage and you're like, I could press Revenge here, but I need this rage to spend on a shield block or spend on an ignore pain, so I can't actually press Revenge here, and that just leads to more dead globals than before. Essentially what this means is not only is the gameplay slower, it is much clunkier and just flows worse, which is really sad to see as someone who has enjoyed Prot Warrior gameplay over the last couple of expansions. What Prot Warrior really needs right now to feel a bit better to play is just some sort of filler ability, which ironically does actually exist in their kit in Devastate. However, it is just so much weaker than Devastator, which removes the ability to cast it entirely, that everyone just specs into that talent. So basically you're forced to pick between better throughput or the spec's gameplay feeling better, which 9 times out of 10 people are going to pick throughput in 2025. There are some solutions to this though. Of course, you could just buff the hell out of Devastate itself to make people take that and not take the talent, which honestly is just kind of a band-aid fix. You could try and introduce some new fillers. For example, both Slam and Whirlwind are spells that Prot Warrior have, but they cost Rage, so you could remove that cost and just adjust their output slightly to make them into single target and AoE filler spells. You could also do this to just one of them if you don't want to have too many keybinds. My personal preference is kind of an adjustment on option 1, which gives you that filler ability while also maintaining what is fun and nice about Devastator, which in my opinion is the fact that it gives melees a chance to proc your Shield Slam. So basically add melees as a possible trigger to the strategist talent directly beneath it. Then you remove the Devastator talent as a whole. It's just gone, and in its place you can put a new talent that buffs Devastate in some way. Maybe it gives it, a significant damage boost. Maybe it gives it the ability to cleave or do AoE damage. Just something there. It doesn't need to be super complicated, but doing that would give you access to that Devastate filler, a filler that exists already in the Prot Warrior kit, and you still have the ability to have Shield Slam resets via melees, which doesn't feel too strong in my opinion, considering that they again just slash the chance for these procs to happen from 30% to 20% for all your other abilities. So putting the melees in there doesn't feel like it's excessive in my opinion, and I think this would fix the dead global problem and just generally make the spec feel much smoother to play. But there we have it, guys. That is my initial tank feedback for the first iteration of the 11.1 PTR. Obviously, some specs did get more coverage here than the others because there were a varying amount of changes, so apologies if I didn't say too much about your spec. That being said, I would love to hear what you guys think about tanks currently. What do you like? What do you dislike? What do you want to see change? Let me know down in the comments below, and make sure you are subscribed for all of my PTR coverage as well as for all my dungeon, raid, and tank guides, which will be coming out closer to the patch launch. As always, shout out to all of my amazing Patreons for helping to make content like this possible, and I'll see everyone in the next video.